Afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Wednesday, June the 9th, 2021. I wanted to begin today by speaking about democracy, the twilight of democracy. As you may recall, I devoted some weeks to going over James Burnham's The Machiavellians. And of course, Burnham had very strong views on democracy and what its stated purpose is and what its real purpose is. I was reminded of that when I came across a tweet by Blair Nathan, who wrote, "Watching American civic religion change in real time also leaves me with a poor impression of normies. Consent manufacturing works, retconning works, the megaphone works. Democracy is all good and well as an electoral mechanism, but it's kind of a post hoc way to launder power." He continued, "As Antonin Scalia put it, in a narrow legal sense, but it also applies more broadly. The question of gay marriage is not particularly interesting, but the question of who rules me is very interesting." Someone called SB057 responded to Nathan, "The entire point of democracy is to create a, quote, legitimate state. That is to say, because citizens have a say in their government, that in turns means that they have no justifiable reason to overthrow it. It was never about actually giving the citizenry actual power." I responded to Nathan, "Much of James Burnham's The Machiavellians is an explanation of why democracy is a con job. The masses have not the talent, inclination, or means to exercise real political power. The iron law of oligarchy always applies. The many will always be ruled by the few. Both the Tea Party and MAGA were betrayed by the oligarchs, the deep state. But the good news is our elites are now so stupid and corrupt as to risk implosion. Their praxis has been reduced to looting the middle class, sexual depravity, and hatred of whites. The only positive policy proposal the elite has to offer is the so-called Green New Deal. This is an obvious non-starter, but the elite may well destroy the world economy thereby and kill off billions in their folly." Let's look at the immigration question from the point of view of democracy. Were the peoples of the United States, Canada, and Britain, to give three examples, the ones I know the best, were they ever asked whether they wanted their country to be radically transformed demographically and racially? No, they were not, ever. Because if they had been asked, they would have said no. But instead, we have the continuing racial revolution in all three of these countries. Why? Because the elite, the oligarchs, have decided that this is what must be. Now, if you look at the Immigration Act of 1965 in the United States, this was the bill which was written by Emanuel Seller in the House and Senator Philip Hart in the Senate. As far as I can tell, it's based on racial or ethnic animus. Seller was a Jew and Philip Hart was Irish. And I suppose perhaps someone called Philip Hart's grandfather a Paddy all those years ago. And Hart seemed to resonate with a hatred of the historic American nation. Now, of course, another fellow of Irish descent, Senator Edward Kennedy, swore up and down, he was the major cheerleader for the 65 bill, that it would not transform America's demography. Well, they were lying. They were all lying through their teeth, and for different reasons. The left, because it hates the historic American nation, and the right, or let's say Conservatism Inc., because immigrants lower wages. That it's that simple, really. Immigrants lower wages, which means more profits for big business. Now, at first, we were told that no. There's no big, great replacement going on. And then the next line was, don't you like diversity and spicy food? And the third line was, shut up, bigots. This has been decided, and there's nothing that you can do about it. And increasingly, there is nothing that we can do about it because this massive immigration from places that did not supply settlers or later immigrants to the United States, it's shifting the goalposts. The more immigrants there are in any country, the less likely there is to be any halt to immigration. Now, some people would regard this as treason, but that is such is the world of democracy that we live in. Oh, yes. Did you know that the soldiers, Canadian soldiers, British soldiers and American soldiers who fought in Europe in World War II were Antifa? Did you know that? This is, an obvious example of the retconning that Blair Nathan talked about. Oh, yes, and our society, Britain has always been black, always. Why, Anne Boleyn, no less than Anne Boleyn, was black. Now, these are all lies, but what is it that we can do about it? Such as the limits of democracy, when the two sides get together, well, that's called bipartisanship. What are you, some sort of political fanatic? When Enoch Powell made his famous 1968 Rivers of Blood speech in Birmingham, he instantly became the most popular political figure in England. But the elite, the oligarchy, ganged up against him. One could expect such a reaction from Harold Wilson's Labour Party, but the Conservative Party, and Powell was a Conservative MP at the time, was perhaps even more fervent in its denunciation of Powell than Labour had been. A lot of people who call themselves conservative have very strange ideas about immigration. For instance, that immigrants are better than us. They are more moral, they are harder working, they are all natural-born entrepreneurs. None of this is true. But there's the megaphone. Yes, how can you be against immigrants? Jason Kenney, now Premier of Alberta, is a particularly virulent example of the immigrants are better than us. Oh, no. These chain stores, chain restaurants, they can't get Canadians to work because Canadians are too lazy. Well, no, that's not true, actually. If these places like Subway paid their workers decent wages, there would be no problem, but they are determined not to pay their workers decent wages. How about the transferring of American manufacturing to China and other countries? Were the American people asked about that? Consulted via the democratic process? No, they were not. For the obvious reason, once again, that if they had been asked, they would have said no. Actually, they would have said, hell no. That, oh, yes, this is globalism, and globalism is good. Good for whom? Is it good for Americans? Is it good for Canadians? Is it good for Britons? No, it is not. It is, however, very good for the 1% because it means greater profits. How about the deregulation of the banking or financial services industry? Were the American people ever asked about that? No, Senator Phil Gramm, a Republican, joined together with some Democrats who were friendly with big business and decided this would be an excellent idea. Now, this led directly to the economic collapse of 2007, 2008, which nearly destroyed the world economy. And what was the upshot of this financial excess, greed, and criminality? Everybody got made whole, except for one unfortunate company, which was made a scapegoat. Time magazine had its cover Alan Greenspan and Larry Summers and some other were the committee to save the world. The people that had led the world into this disaster had to be given even more power. And that's how democracy works, because essentially Republicans and Democrats, liberals and conservatives, liberals and labor, they are not enemies. They all belong to the same party, the government party. And now our governments take their marching orders from the 1%, from big business. And of course, this is bipartisanship. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Tea Party was very angry about what was going on in America. And this led to the Republicans making spectacular gains. But the Republican pros said, okay, thank you for your work. Thank you for your money. But the pros are in charge now. And they proceeded to sell out the Tea Party. And as I mentioned, the same thing happened with Make America Great Again. That any arrangement which was going to lead to, say, less power for the CIA and the other so-called alphabet agencies of the hilariously named intelligence community, no, they were not going to stand for this. And big business was not going to stand for it, because making America great again would mean that they wouldn't be making as much money as they were previously. So yes, a democracy is a con job. Let's see, going back to Blair Nathan, Tom Elliott had tweeted, Barack Obama scoffs at the suggestion critical race theory is a threat to our republic. There are certain right-wing media venues, for example, that monetize and capitalize on stoking the fear and resentment of a white population that is witnessing a changing America. Yeah, changing America. That's an interesting way to describe wholesale demographic replacement. Nathan responded, Obama isn't entirely wrong here. Conservatism Inc. dog whistles about these things without actually intending to do anything about it. So in that sense, the Republicans do indeed exploit ethnic concerns for political gain. Of course, those concerns are 100% valid, though, especially now that we are hearing actual exterminationist language from the elite. And if we're not getting exterminationist language, we're getting, oh, you white people better shut the hell up, because you're going to be a minority soon, and then you're really going to get it in the neck. Nathan also tweeted, the problem isn't that whites are anxious about becoming a minority. They should be. No other race would have even allowed such a hostile elite to get this far. The problem is that conservatives translate that political capital into something tax cuts, own the libs. Or I suppose another example would be Dummycrats are the real racists. And one more from Nathan. Personally, I have little interest in Obama. Well-socialized imperial cosmopolitans are a dime a dozen now. I just consider them alien, fundamentally unwilling, and unable to represent the Amerikaner interest. We need less Fox News dog whistling and more unapologetic ethnic candor. Let's go to the chat. Hello to Palpicasso88, Camel69, Gamion, Random Number Generator, Dan Don Willis, William Hicks, Roulette Cracked, Texas Feral Hog, who says, Green New Deal is a sad boondoggle. Yes, everyone is going to be forced to have electric cars. Where is all this electricity coming from? Especially that jurisdictions all over North America are, no, we've got to stop burning coal to make electricity. Well, where's it going to come from then? Windmills? And this is especially risible given that the electrical infrastructure in the United States is already tottering. But no, we can't use gasoline anymore. We have to use electricity. Where is it going to come from? Well, someone will figure that out. Yes, there is no evidence that this so-called green power is even scalable. And as I've mentioned before, in the interim, two parallel systems will need to be in operation. The old so-called dirty system and the new green system. Don Willis says, people all over the world join hands, start a love a train. Are you in Gibraltar now, Kevo? Says Razvan Anton. That was a little joke I made over the weekend. David the Gnome says, someone warned me the other day that democracy was in danger. Yes, apparently there's going to be a fascist takeover in the United States led by Donald Trump. Now, it's obvious why people are saying this. Members of the elite are saying this because they're afraid of what's going to happen in the 2022 midterms and even more afraid of what's going to happen in the 2024 presidential election. And they are preemptively invalidating the legitimacy of any Republican victory in 2022 or 2024. True Greenberg says there are two steps to the awakening of white racial consciousness. One, when you realize what is going on, and two, when you realize how long it has been going on. Alcasso 88 says Jason Kenney enjoys a footlong at Subway. Let's see. This is Euro Ministerium says, at this point, conservatives are worse than liberals because at least liberals aren't claiming to conserve anything, while conservatives use a guise of conservative titleship to put blinders on the general public while pushing neoliberal ideas that rival even the most leftist parties in the world. Yes, your way of life has to be destroyed. Well, why? Because it's going to increase the economic aggregate. Oh, well, you know what? I don't live in an aggregate. I live in a country that has specific needs. And perhaps, the rulers of our country have certain obligations to the people that they ostensibly represent. But no, we cannot question the dictates of neoliberalism. And once again, never call yourself a conservative. David the Gnome says, in America, really, what is there to conserve? Oh, family values. Remember when Republicans used to go on about family values? And now we find out that family values include gay adoption and gay marriage and drag queen story hour. Values are endlessly mutable. And what else do we have? Jay Miller, hello. As Kevin notes, conservatism is a moribund brand. Yes, indeed. It should have packed up in 1991 when the Soviet Union was dissolved. And it was Thomas Sowell who pointed out back in the 90s that the term conservatism is, a misnomer because, again, what is there left to conserve? We need a rebrand, says Don Willis. Conservative equals yuck to anyone under 45. Oh, here's another bait and switch. Conservatism Inc. told people on the right, oh, you should vote for us. You should give us your time, your energy, and most importantly, your money because of abortion. What have Republicans in the House and the Senate ever done about abortion? Nothing. Nothing at all. True Greenbird says, funny how critical race theory is only critical of one race. Nuclear is our only hope, says Texas Feral Hog. Euroministerium says bring back the BC Socreds. In my opinion, the only third position party in Canada has ever had, and they are the most successful party as well in terms of infrastructure and fiscal growth. I'm not so sure about that. You have people touting the virtues of, say, the Socreds under W.A.C. Bennett in British Columbia and the Socreds in Alberta. In the 1960s and early 1970s, the money was coming in so quickly that they couldn't spend it. They couldn't spend it all. Meanwhile, they were building up future obligations, which later would prove to be crippling. Let's see. Rune, what is this? Gisting? Luke Ford is so pissed off right now. The KMG is having more viewers than the Luke Ford live stream. I don't know whether that's true or not. I haven't really checked this. Roulette Crack says, Greta Thunberg says, shows up with a hard hat to hang a condemned sign on the Kardashians. Okay. Unofficial KMG fan club says, I don't know why it would be interesting to see KMG review Imperium Press's Beowulf translation. William Hicks says, poll workers in Atlanta, Georgia being deposed per Zero Hedge. It's starting to get interesting. And Trump doesn't even defend the January 6th insurrectionists being mistreated in federal detention. Worthless. I'll have more to say about this in a few minutes. It's an extraordinary situation, what is going on with the judiciary with regard to what happened on January the 6th. Here's a piece by Ed West, whose book on medieval civilization and how it affected Game of Thrones, or Game of Thrones borrowing from that, I reviewed some time ago. I quite liked it. Ed West has a piece in unheard.com, that's UNHERD. Fascism isn't coming. In this age of political hypochondria, everyone wants to be a hero. He begins by confessing that he's somewhat of a hypochondriac, and in the past few years, I've had at least 7 different types of cancer diagnosed by Dr. Google. He says, if a civilization has suffered from a uniquely appalling trauma, then anything that vaguely resembles its early symptoms will cause people to fear it's all happening again. Just like real health anxiety, political hypochondria is spread by the internet, with commentators and activists the equivalent of those dubious American health sites warning that your headache is going to kill you. But instead of cancer, we have fascism, a disease the commentariat can diagnose everywhere. As with health anxiety, political hypochondria has risen with the invention of the iPhone, reaching a new intensity after Donald Trump secured the Republican Party nomination 5 years ago. After that, in his subsequent election, America's commentariat whipped themselves into a hysteria that the country was on the verge of a fascist takeover. Trump's presidency produced a booming literature in fascism is coming literature, among them Madeleine Albright's Fascism, a Warning, a Cass Sunstein's Can It Happen Here?, and How Democracies Die by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt. Entertainment also ran with the idea with HBO's adaptation of The Plot Against America, imagining what a fascist United States would look like. But while Trump's political demise has caused a collapse in his symbiotic media haters, the fear of fascism will remain a constant, especially if, as he warned last week, he returns in 2024. Just in the past few months, Timothy Snyder, Yale professor and highly respected historian of the Second World War and Holocaust, warned in The Road to Unfreedom about growing threats to freedom in the West, while Jason Stanley's How Fascism Works focused on the ideology, its evocation of a mythic past, victimhood, and use of scapegoats. Britain's Paul Mason also has an upcoming book, How to Fight Fascism, in which he warns the core of fascism's belief system today is clear, that majority ethnic groups have become the victims of migration and multiculturalism, that the gains of feminism should be reversed, that democracy is dispensable, that science, universities, and the media cannot be trusted, that nations have lost their way and need to become great again, and that there will soon be a cataclysmic event which sets things right. Yes, fascism. It's pretty funny when we have this. Let's see. We have the government or governments and big business and academia getting together to set policy. Seems rather like corporatism to me. I recall that Tom Wolfe wrote in a famous essay when he was listening to Gunter Grass and others talk about the coming American fascism, what in the late 1960s, that fascism is always descending, coming to earth in the United States, but somehow it only ever lands in Europe. And he mocked Grass and the others. I believe Paul Krasner was another one. That if America's on the verge of fascism, why aren't these people hiding away instead of ranting on a stage at Princeton University? Ed West continues, it would be easier to take these warnings more seriously if they hadn't been made so often before. Before Trump, George W. Bush was also routinely accused of undermining American democracy and having a plan similar to Hitler's, although this has all been forgotten now that he's recast as a cuddly imbecile who draws nice pictures of immigrants. Those fearing Bush's anti-terror legislation to be a modern-day enabling act were spurred by the sensationally popular 2003 article listing 14 defining characteristics of fascism. Author Lawrence Britt identified symptoms such as identification of enemies or scapegoats as a unifying cause, a potential and continuing expressions of nationalism, disdain for the importance of human rights, disdain and suppression of intellectuals and the arts, and obsession with crime and punishment as signs of fascism. And it all sounded eerily like what was happening. The fear grew after the financial crisis of 2007 because we all know that Hitler's rise began with the Wall Street crash, and indeed the rise of national populist parties across Europe seemed to confirm all the old fears that fascism might return. But as I expressed earlier, somehow the result of what happened in 2007, 2008 was that the neoliberals became even more powerful than they were previously. West continues, national populism is not the same as fascism. It's a particular response to recent unprecedented levels of immigration, populist support correlating with rising diversity. While fascism is expansionist, violent, and consciously elitist, populism tends to be defensive and democratic, even egalitarian. Fascism was youthful, the product of a young society, espousing vigor, action, and the nobility of youthful sacrifice. I should point out that Donald Trump was the first peace president in quite a long time, and it is the so-called anti-fascists who never stop howling that America is not bombing enough countries. There are fascist parties today in Europe, such as Golden Dawn of Greece and Jobbik of Hungary, but not many. Much of this political hypochondria stems from the work of Theodor Adorno and his F-scale test, which was used to assess fascist personality types, asking questions about obedience, sexual relations, lifestyles, and so on. The F-scale was tested in post-war America, where it was found that fascism was latent everywhere. In the 1950s, Adorno warned that fascism was a real danger to America, despite that whole communism thing, and was convinced that fascism was finding a new home there. Soon his prophecy turned true, and America famously fell to fascism with the Civil Rights Acts, Flower Power, and Woodstock. What the F-scale was measuring was not fascism, but conservatism, and to a political hypochondriac, it's easy to mistake them. Conservatism is, after all, parochial, drawn to attachments that are local and national rather than global. Conservatism is defined by more traditional gender norms, a greater respect for parental authority, a harder line on crime, and it has a certain disdain for intellectuals, which is unsurprising when you consider the insane ideas thought up by intellectuals. One of the curious things about the Trump era was that so many American journalists seemed to fear a fascist dictatorship that they actually desired it. They longed to be part of a heroic struggle against the forces of darkness, one in which all doubt and anxiety and everyday blandness was washed away, ironically, like so many bored young men of the Belle Epoque. Yes, all this talk of la résistance, you shall not pass. as if, after Trump was elected, as if somehow Franco had invaded from North Africa. Yes, in my experience, West concludes, the only way to avoid hypochondria is to just stop worrying and focus on other things, and maybe something else will kill you in the meantime. The same, I suspect, is true of our civilization. Okay, this piece came out on June the 1st. I didn't see it until today. It's from Vanity Fair, Best 11, and it is absolutely berserk. Trump has reportedly been telling people he's going to be president again by August, which would suggest he's planning a coup or has fully descended into madness. I think that the progressives are attempting to meme something into existence. Best 11 writes, is Donald Trump ever going to be president again? In theory, should he set aside the fact that he actually hated being president? Oh, he hated being president, did he? These are the same people who said in 2015 and 2016 that the only reason that Donald Trump announced a bid for the Republican nomination for the presidency was to boost his brand, that he never intended to become president or even run for president. And if he got the Republican nomination, he would decline it. Now, pretty much everything that the media has said about Trump since 2015 has been a blatant lie, but that doesn't stop them from keeping on. According to New York Times reporter Maggie Haberman, and who could be more trustworthy than a New York Times reporter, Trump has apparently been telling a number of people he's in contact with that he fully expects he will get reinstated as president by August. Yeah. Okay. All right. And again, what is the purpose of all this talk? Republican victories are illegitimate. So if the Republicans were to take control of the House or the Senate, illegitimate, must be stopped. Republicans are planning to steal the election, well, in 2022 and 2024. This cannot be allowed to happen. Here is an outrageous story from Rachel Weiner and Spencer Hsu of the Washington Post. Trump's election fraud claims propelled them to the Capitol on January 6th. His ongoing comments are keeping them in jail. What Trump has to say about what transpired on November the 6th and 7th is absolutely irrelevant to whether people who trespassed in the Capitol are kept in prison or not. The Washington Post is making it very clear that these people are being held, are being martyred to show up Donald Trump, to own Donald Trump. Trump's continued refusal to accept the results of the 2020 election is helping to keep some of those supporters behind bars. Quote, the steady drumbeat that inspired defendant to take up arms? What arms? Has not faded away. 6 months later, the canard that the election was stolen is being repeated daily on major news outlets and from the corridors of power in state and federal government, not to mention the near daily fulminations of the former president. U.S. District Judge Amy Berman Jackson wrote recently in denying bond to a Colorado man. Although Trump has been blocked from major social media platforms and recently shut down his own blog, he is still monitoring and promoting false claims of election fraud. Citing Trump's ongoing comments, federal judges have shared fears that those defendants accused of the worst violence, what worst violence, or threats of violence that day remain a danger to public safety. Unfortunately, said Judge Amit Mehta, in detaining a man accused of throwing a hatchet and desk during the riot, the political dynamics that gave way to January 6th have not faded. Perhaps these people should be kept in prison for the rest of their lives, or as long as Donald Trump remains alive. And speaking of a coup, I had never heard of Frank Figliuzzi before, but he appeared on MSNBC to talk about January 6th. And who is this fellow when he's at home? Well, he hosts The Bureau with Frank Figliuzzi. which is a podcast. He is a retired FBI assistant director, NBC News national security contributor. Yes, the alphabet agency to media pipeline continues. And this is what he said. Arresting low-level operatives is merely a speed bump, not a roadblock. In order to really tackle terrorism, you've got to attack and dismantle the command and control element. That may mean people sitting in Congress right now. So the deep state is now saying that members of Congress must be arrested. Well, yes, again, who is it that's actually promoting a coup? Kyle Schittler, who is Director Senior Analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, responded, "We should demand that every senior FBI official from Wray to the lowest level supervisory agent denounce this talk and make clear this lunacy is unacceptable. If they do not, shutter the agency forever." I was talking about globalism and how it has panned out. Apparently there is a fear. I'll just remind people that circa 2000, I think it was even earlier than that. I think it was around 1997. Alan Greenspan, no less than Alan Greenspan, said that immigration must be kept high in order to keep wages low. He actually let the cat out of the bag. And was the response incredulity and outrage? No, because the elite, the oligarchs, all believe that immigration must be kept high in order to keep wages low. And there is a rather frightened piece from Chris Anstey on Bloomberg. A big question about rising wages. Oh dear, wages are rising in the United States. We can't have that. U.S. wage gains were supposed to be weakening this spring, according to the experts and even White House economists. The thinking was that average pay rises would be depressed as hundreds of thousands of Americans went back to work in jobs in lower wage sectors like restaurants and lodging. The May jobs report confirmed that that's not at all how it's panning out, as Olivia Rockman and Reed Pickert explain. While politicians and economists debate the reasons, it's clear that labor shortages have forced many employers to boost pay or offer bonuses, which has led to unexpected increases in average hourly earnings. Isn't that how the market is supposed to work? Wage gains are a good thing for those that are getting them and for the broader economy if they are spent. Again, saving money is a bad thing. Saving money is wicked. Thus, the neo-libs have declared. But permanent base wage increases could also escalate pressure on consumer prices, which are already surging. Oh, and of course, the money supply apparently we went through this argument in the 1970s and the 80s. Oh, it's unions demanding more money, which are responsible for inflation. No, it is an increase in the money supply. Apparently, we've learned nothing. A report Thursday is forecast to show consumer prices rose 0.4% in May from the month prior, building on a steady string of price increases. Among those hiking wages lately, McDonald's, Chipotle Mexican Grill, Costco, and small businesses. The fact that we're seeing companies commit to wage increases means that they believe that they need to raise long-term wages in order to attract talent, said Daniel Zhao, senior economist at Glassdoor Inc. That signals that they perceive a longer-term challenge to attracting workers that couldn't be solved just by offering one-time bonuses. Much of this may cool as health concerns abate and jobless benefits run down in coming months. But the developments add to the case for the Federal Reserve to raise its level of vigilance. Yes, the Federal Reserve spending money or creating money like the proverbial drunken sailor. But no, we can't have this money ending up in the hands of ordinary people. That is bad for the economy. Former Fed Vice Chair Donald Cohn said Tuesday he'd like to see policymakers openly acknowledge the inflationary dangers they face and reflect that in their next set of quarterly economic forecasts next week. One of my correspondents had this to say about the Bloomberg piece. Home prices being bid 20% over asking price, stock market up almost 100% within 52 weeks, and the downside is wages rising by a tiny percentage. Yeah, well, I suppose it depends who is getting the money. And of course, the 1% getting the money, the rich getting richer, well, are you opposed to that? Well, yes, I am. Since so many of these people are merely toll keepers, and this is happening because the middle class is being looted. Oh, what are you, a communist or something? Here's something that the peoples of the United States were asked what they thought about the gay revolution, particularly as regards to gay marriage, and they said no, repeatedly. The votes of legislatures and in referenda. But the elite, the oligarchs, said, shut the hell up. You are going to get gay marriage whether you like it or not. Oh, but that's the last demand. No, it's never the last demand. This is a story from a Breitbart by Alana Mastrangelo. Pride Month, Nickelodeon drag queen music video explains the colors of the alphabet people flag. Nickelodeon is promoting Pride Month to children with a new video featuring drag queen Nina West, who sings about the meaning of all the colors on the Pride flag. Every color on the Pride flag is a symbol in the sky, and I'm proud to be me every time I see that Pride flag waving high. West sings for the Viacom CBS property. Red means life because living is a gift. Orange means healing, and we have to persist in working to heal the world and healing ourselves. Yellow means sunlight because you gotta shine bright. Green means nature, and we gotta fight to keep our earth a thriving home for life. The song goes on to ask, doesn't it just fill you with pride, showing who you are on the inside? Is that what it's showing you, what these people are like on the inside? The drag queen then points out that the colors that he says are meant to represent transgender individuals as well as specific skin colors. Baby blue, pink, and white represent transgender people because every letter in LGBTQ plus is equal, and black and brown represent the queer and trans people of color. Yes, this is what the progressive agenda comes down to, is sexual deviance and hating white people. The Pride Month video is not Nickelodeon's only promotion of transgenderism to children. The previous week, Blues Clues and You put out a sing-along video also featuring drag queen Nina West, where cartoon animals of eclectic queer demographics participate in a pride parade. The Children's Network has also cast its first ever openly transgender teenage actor in a live-action show, Sacha A. Cohen, who will be featured in Nickelodeon's the series Danger Force. You know, sex education was very controversial when it was first introduced. Many parents argued that it was none of the school's business, that this is the duty of parents to teach their children whatever they like about sex or not. But no, yes, this was a health necessity. So now we have 5-year-olds being groomed in schools. And, okay. Yes, we are constantly told, again by the elite, of white supremacism. Whereas, of course, again, if anything resembling white supremacism obtained in the United States or Canada, we wouldn't be in the situation we are in now. This is from John Nolte at Breitbart. Claim Black students at a Spokane, Washington middle school were ordered to pick cotton as a school assignment. Verdict false. The disturbing story is already viral. From BET, black middle school students reportedly ordered to pick cotton. From NPR, cotton picking lesson leaves black middle school students reeling. In Spokane, from ABC, black students humiliated by cotton picking assignment. And from Drudge, shock. Black middle school students ordered to pick cotton. This sounds awful, right? Who would do such a thing? The mother of the two 14-year-old girls at the center of this racial storm pulled the twin girls not only out of the class, but out of the school entirely, and is demanding, according to ABC News, the removal of a school administrator whose suggestion was to separate two black students after their mom raised concerns about a classroom assignment the students say involved cleaning cotton. Here's how the mother portrayed the principal's suggestion. He wanted to segregate my girls into a room by themselves away from the white teacher. The outraged mother told local news, for you to pass out cotton to my children and tell them that essentially they're going to pick the cotton clean and it's a race of who can get it clean first, that was extremely bothersome to me and my children. She added, under no circumstance do they need to be taught what it's like to be a slave or what it's like to be black. Well, of course, that is not what happened. Twins, Mziah and I don't know how this is pronounced, but I'll try. Ziyishauni Fiesel said they were in their social studies class on May 3rd when they said the teacher pulled out a box of raw cotton and told the class they were going to do a fun activity. The girls added the students were subsequently instructed to clean freshly picked cotton as part of a classroom assignment to see who could do the fastest. Let's start with the most important point. Nolte adds, by their own admission, the girls admit no one forced them or even asked them to pick cotton, which proves all these stories and headlines false. Cleaning and picking cotton are two entirely different things. Picking cotton is obviously associated with slavery, but cleaning cotton is associated with what the school says was part of an assignment about the Industrial Revolution and cotton gin, an invention that revolutionized the cotton industry by putting an end to the tedious and time-consuming labor involved in removing the seeds from the cotton by hand. Is it not fairly obvious that this teacher used a hands-on assignment to show the class just what a revolution, the Industrial Revolution, was, an assignment that had nothing to do with picking cotton? Well, soon enough, I don't know, perhaps the word cotton will be banned because it's too triggering to certain people. I'm not joking about this, by the way. The people are looking to be outraged. They're looking to be outraged at white people. And of course, the media jumps to attack white people based on the flimsiest of evidence or no. Chogokin666 says, the epoch of hoax. Roulette Crack said there is a correlation between their names and the size of the chip on the shoulder. Chogokin666 says KMG Buck-Breaking Theater Thursday. I only heard of this buck-breaking craze today. It seems simply insane to me. I don't understand it. I don't understand what this Tashik fellow is going on about. But now we're having explanations that apparently the rape of black slaves has nothing to do with homosexuality. No. It's all too much. It's all so tiresome. Texas Feral Hog says, my mom was forced to pick cotton for a day by her mother to appreciate how hard it was. Berkan Sultanov says, cotton is an Arabic word, el katan. Contraku says, people need to read Herbert Mancuse's Repressive Tolerance. It is the game plan for the modern left and details a Maoist-style cultural revolution for the West, genocides and all. Of course, Marcuse argued that sexual perversion, sexual deviance was necessary to crush the right. Chokokin666 again, the contrast between the absurd first name and anodyne Anglo surname always amuses me. Okay. Shouldn't the red on the pride flag? Yeah, I'm not going to repeat that from Rustin Shackelford. No. I'm pro-democracy, says Ricardo Williams. William Hicks says some restaurants in the Detroit area are offering hiring bonuses, $500 and $18 an hour. In one instance I heard about recently. Well, you will recall when, during the fracking boom, that, oh my God, these people in North Dakota or whatever, people who work in convenience stores or North Dakota are earning ridiculous wages. What's it to you, by the way? Are these people who are working in convenience stores in North Dakota, are they building, 350-foot yachts? Are they building spaceships to fly to Mars? Are they? You just see the hatred that our elite has for ordinary people. How dare they earn $18 an hour? Edwin says, does anyone have a link for that Greenspan quote? Is there a video of it? I think Alex D claimed some time ago in chat that Greenspan never said it. Well, I read it at the time. I mean, I could go looking for it. Contra says, the whole insurrection narrative is just insane when you consider how just weeks earlier Antifa riots forced the White House to lock down. The media then mocked him as bunker boy for it. Yes, there was an attempt to storm the White House. Also, I could point out that the rioting, the looting, the burning that accompanied the mostly peaceful George Floyd Memorial riots, this is justified. It's righteous indignation. Well, this is a truth that violence works. It's a truth that violence works, but I suppose it all depends on who is committing the violence. We still have yet to be told who opened the doors to the Capitol building, because it would not have been possible for this mob, or whatever you want to call it, to enter the Capitol if the doors had remained closed, because they are formidable doors indeed. Okay, what are we going to talk about next? We're going to talk about, yes, I talked about Hunter Biden, the latest from Hunter Biden, and asked the question, is this the end for him? No, apparently not, because Hunter Biden is simply not newsworthy. Ellie Kemper being crowned by some organization that no one had ever heard of when she was 19 years old, that is very much newsworthy. And she was forced to utter a groveling apology, which sounded as if it had been extracted at gunpoint. But Joel Pollack writes in Breitbart, the mainstream media breathlessly reported rumors for several years that a tape existed of President Donald Trump saying the N-word, but largely ignored a report Tuesday that Hunter Biden used it in text messages with his lawyer. On Tuesday, the Daily Mail reported that Hunter Biden had used the N-word repeatedly in text messages with an attorney, George Masiris, who is white. The text messages were downloaded from Hunter Biden's infamous laptop. Yes, CBS News, for example, reported in 2018 that disgruntled former White House staffer Omarosa Manigault-Newman claimed Trump staffers were aware of such a tape, but downplayed the fact the staffers later said no tape existed. Comedian Tom Arnold undertook a vast search for tapes from NBC's The Apprentice on which Trump was supposed to have said the N-word. No such tapes were ever found, either during Trump's presidency or in the months following. This isn't in the story, but just, a couple of weeks ago, Stephen Colbert was chortling that a recent media takeover would mean that we're finally going to get the N-word tape from Donald Trump. Yes, in the Universal Mental Retardation file, I'll tell Mr. Putin what I want him to know. U.S. troops in the UK cheer Biden's warning to the Russian president and his tearful tribute to Beau. Oh, just stop. At the start of his 8-day Europe trip. The commander-in-chief also told the crowd global warming was the biggest threat to America. Okay, he teared up as he thanked military personnel, the Royal Air Force, Mildenhall, for their service and mentioned his late son, Beau, an Army major. Yes, there's all kinds of levels of service, but the late Beau Biden was in JAG, just like David A. French, in the green zone there. which is quite possibly the safest place on Earth. Oh, by the way, you may have seen a picture of Dr. Jill Biden boning up on a book, a big book, a binder, in advance of the G7 conference. Why on earth would she be there? Her expertise in what, remedial reading classes. And here's something that you may not know. It's simply false that the leaders of the G7 or the G20, they all get together and they all hash out the problems of the world. No, they don't. Bureaucrats come up with, in advance, what is going to be agreed to. I mean, just consider the logistics. Consider, global warming, consider terrorism, consider all these problems. So you're going to have 7 or 20 men and their staff actually arguing about these things, and they're going to work this all out in the space of a couple of days? No, not possible. But the media continues to gaslight us every year as if, terribly important things are being decided at these meetings. All that is being done at these meetings is that billions of dollars are being wasted. Yes, this is from Pegida, Canada. Tragedy turned into political opportunity. As we mentioned in our last blog, the tragedy in London is having far-reaching repercussions. The attack on the right wing is in full swing. Anyone that dares mention any concern about Islamism is ostracized, attacked, vilified, and generally made to feel very unsafe. Our Twitter feed is unpublished. Our Facebook page was unpublished several months ago. There is absolutely no mention of threats from the Islamist community against the Jewish community in the last several weeks. Politicians are falling all over themselves to condemn far-right groups. The vigil in London was well attended last evening. Politicians from all sectors spoke against Islamophobia, politicians that previously decried the term. That would be a reference to Aaron O'Toole. Human rights organizations, many of them having attending our rallies in violent opposition, have taken advantage of this tragedy as well. The tragedy has turned into a political opportunity on the federal, provincial, municipal, and religious levels. It is shameful and shows no sensitivity for the family of those who lost their lives. It seems to be an opportunity for interviews, grandstanding, and political posturing. So, speaking of political posturing, let's go to the latest from Max Fawcett at the National Observer. Authorities are still deciding how to characterize the attack in London, Ontario earlier this week that killed 4 members of the same Muslim family. But for thousands of other Muslim Canadians, there's only one word that comes to mind: terrorism. And while Prime Minister Justin Trudeau suggested that Islamophobia has no place in any of our communities, the unfortunate reality is that there are many communities in Canada where anti-Muslim bigotry is already firmly rooted. Oh, and let's mention Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole, because they were opposed to the motion, the government motion in 2017 that condemned Islamophobia, whatever that might be. Well, former ministers Kelly Leitch and Chris Alexander appeared at a rally organized by Rebel Media and described by the Toronto Star's Susan Delacourt as a hateful free-for-all against political correctness. That rally took place at Canada Christian College, the institution run by Charles McVety, who just happens to be a political ally of Ontario Premier Doug Ford. McVety makes no secret of his disdain for Islam and those who practice it, and he's reportedly argued that, quote, "We know that Christians and Jews and Hindus don't have the same mandate for a hostile takeover," unquote. Let's bring in Derek Sloan. Oh, Maxime Bernier has a history of making Islamophobic remarks, including a baseless claim during the 2019 federal election that Islamic extremists had infiltrated Canadian politics. Ho, ho. Islamic extremists had infiltrated Canadian politics as early as the 1990s, as I reported at the time. Oh, the National Post published an op-ed from Rex Murphy on the apparent problem of anti-white racism, which is a perfect example of where his priorities really lie. Oh, how about that? That his priorities really lie with Canadians and not foreigners? As Haroon Siddiqui noted in a 2016 speech to the Aga Khan Foundation, yes, that august body Hardly a week goes by without these publications finding something or other wrong with Muslims and Islam. These publications are forever looking for terrorists under every Canadian minaret. How about, we're talking about assault on democracy? How about when that Islamic extremist attempted to shoot up the House of Commons and came very close to killing a bunch of MPs and even the Prime Minister of Canada? But let's not talk about that. Let's not talk about that incident in Toronto a couple of years ago when a Muslim did the same thing that happened in London, Ontario, and decided plowing through people on a sidewalk on Danforth Avenue in Toronto. But that is not classified as a terrorist attack, a religious-based attack, apparently because the fellow who did it is a little loopy in the head. Oh, I would suggest, with regard to what happened in London, Ontario, that any man who decides to drive up onto the sidewalk in an attempt to wipe out a family is could be described as loopy in the head, but that is not what we are going to hear. So yes, the Conservative Party must be purged, the media must be purged, Canada's religions must be purged. And from Fawcett's mouth, he does speak for a considerable elite constituency. A thoughtful and disturbing article in Lockdown Skeptics by Dr. Sinead Murphy called "The COVID Aesthetic." In his AIER article published June 1st, David McGrogan describes support for Western government's COVID measures as attributable not only to fear of a deadly virus or to care for those who are vulnerable to it, but to the pleasurable add-on awareness that COVID fear and COVID care are felt by everyone else around, insofar as it is comprised primarily of this sense that everyone shares in the COVID experience. The COVID experience, David observed, is kitsch. David's original analysis throws up the intriguing possibility that what we are dealing with in the satisfaction of so many in the COVID regime and their palpable distaste for those who do not share their satisfaction is neither a flawed COVID reasoning nor a distorted COVID morality, but a new COVID aesthetic. And then she describes at considerable length the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, who drew clear lines between objective knowledge, moral judgment, and aesthetic feeling. Kant's classic example of an aesthetic experience is the one occasioned by a beautiful sunset, an example which reveals how removed is personal, factual, practical, and moral content from the aesthetic mode. Imagine that you were sitting outside of a midsummer's evening, watching the sun go down on a glorious day. You had a glass or two of wine, perhaps, and are at leisure and communicative. Ah, you gasp, gazing skywards. Now that's something. Kant was interested in the precise nature of this common experience. His analysis of it threw up some surprising insights. Imagine that your neighbor to the left is sitting outside that evening too. Hearing your ah of satisfaction, he interjects with, "Never mind your ah, I've got my potatoes to think about, and there's no rain promised in that sky." Without wishing harm to your neighbor on the left's potato harvest, Kant would judge you to be well within your rights to feel cheated by this response. Your pleasure at the setting sun was not intended to address its implications for projects, such as that of potato growing, and while you might enter into your green fingers neighbor's concerns at another time, they have, in this particular moment, rather dampened your pleasure at the prospect of the evening sky. Yes, this is a variation of the argument that no one can feel happy in life unless everyone is happy, which is obviously manifestly absurd. Sinead Murphy continues, and now imagine that your neighbor to the right is sitting outside that evening too, hearing your ah of satisfaction, and pausing a moment to allow for the contribution of your neighbor to the left. She proposes the following: "Isn't it interesting that tonight's sunset is occurring about 15 minutes later than last Saturday's sunset?" Again, Kant would have been aghast, as no doubt are you. When we ah at a sunset, we are not in the business of comparisons between the timings of different sunsets. We are in a certain mood, awash with feeling. We have not signed up for our first lecture on the habits of sunsets any more than we have a monologue on the prospects of a good potato harvest. And drawing from this, she concludes, Kant's concluding summary of the essential character of aesthetic experience is that aesthetic experience is disinterested, not uninterested, disinterested. In other words, an aesthetic experience, though it requires to be occasioned by something appropriate, some sunsets are good, has no stake in the thing that occasions it, whether the sunset is early or late, whether it is a sign of rain or not, whether it is red or orange, are of no interest to the person who, sitting at leisure and gazing upon it, feels pleasantly overwhelmed by it. For anyone who has witnessed the apparent immunity of supporters of COVID mitigation measures to the many and various arguments that have been leveled against them, thinking of the COVID experience as an aesthetic experience explains a lot. We have been the neighbor on the right this year, over and over again. We have marshaled more factual evidence than we can archive for the harmfulness of lockdowns, the ineffectiveness of masks, the relative mildness of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and so on. Is the apparent immunity of the COVID consensus to our factual contributions explained by its being an aesthetic experience, essentially untouchable by conceptual analysis? We have also been the neighbor on the left this year, of course. Contributing to the COVID debate are pressing practical concerns for the survival of small businesses, for the education of young people, for the treatment of cancer and other diseases, to name but a few. Is the indifference of the COVID community to the damage being wrought by COVID policies on the most pressing and practical projects due to its aesthetic character? Are those who are caught up in COVID just feeling too deeply to be available for common concerns? And we've also been the neighbor across the way this year too, sometimes in the utmost desperation, overwhelmed by personal feelings of despair and imposed isolation, of panic at mandated masking, of persistent anxiety at the precariousness of all that had heretofore been relied upon. "Please, I don't like this," typed a young child in the chat box of her virtual geography lesson, as reported by the conservative woman a number of months ago. How many of us she cried out for in doing so, and how deaf have been the ears on which her and our cries have fallen. Have our feelings been too personal to move the COVID faithful? Have our panic and anxiety and despair been too particular to melt the hearts of the COVID crowd? If the COVID experience is indeed aesthetic, the impotence of our counter-arguments, our practical concerns, and our personal pains is certainly explained very well. Those we wish to convince to change their minds are not using their minds. Those we wish to share our concerns do not have concerns. Those we wish to feel our distress cannot see us or our distress. They are caught up in a kind of satisfaction, occasioned by the concerted responses of governments and populations to an invisible global attack that is comprised of a heady sense of profound community, a fellow feeling on a universal scale. We cannot touch this experience with our facts and our projects and our pains. At the very most, we can only threaten to puncture its ecstasy. Insofar as we do that, we are battered away as an inconvenient distraction. I've been thinking about this, seeing people again today wearing masks outside when they are alone. Now, there must be a reason for this. How much of it is just plain stupidity? Again, how vast is the atmosphere? Do these people have no understanding of the vastness of the atmosphere? Do they believe that COVID-19 droplets hover in the air, waiting to attack people outside who are not wearing masks? Well, how much of this is an aesthetic experience? I am a better person than you because I'm wearing a mask. There is no efficacy in wearing masks outdoors. You could respond, that is not the point. I'm showing my kindness toward others, but it doesn't avail. That doesn't matter, does it? Mask equals my kindness, my personal superiority. Sinead Murphy concludes, so is the COVID experience a purely aesthetic pleasure or a knowing kitschy enjoyment? Well, here's a bit of kitsch. You remember last year when everyone was banging pots and pans at, 7 o'clock? Or they were doing this once a week in Britain, where they'd all go to the front of their houses and bang pots and pans. It doesn't get kitschier than that. How about the TikTok twerking nurses. It doesn't get kitschier than that. How about the, oh, please, Dr. Fauci, send me vaccine? Again, kitsch, kitsch, kitsch. The clapping for carers in the early months was surely kitsch, says Murphy. Not even the most convinced could have applauded in good faith, without the accompanying sense that this is the kind of thing that everyone would be moved by in a more innocent time. But the distancing and the masking and now the injecting the vitriol against those who do not comply with these measures, undefined moral contempt, allied with unrelenting immunity to arguments of any kind, indicates that the experiences occasioned by these aspects of the COVID regime really and truly are aesthetic experiences, straight up, uncynical, unamused, unknowing experiences of our shared humanity in our well-designed world. If this is so, if the COVID consensus really is an aesthetic experience, then its irresistible appeal is no longer to be wondered at, for it offers no less than the return of the feeling of universal community in an organized world that, however irrational, impractical, and indifferent to the plight of others, cannot be expected to be relinquished easily or soon. Yes, I think there's an awful lot of truth in this. I also think that, as I first mentioned months ago, a great many people are enjoying this. I'm reminded that during the Blitz in London, in other cities in England during World War II, there were some people, put that bloody light out, who made a point of ratting out old people to the police because, or to the home army or whatever, because some single light had been left on. Oh, these people think they can get away with forgetfulness simply because they're old? We'll show them sadism. In the Telegraph, Madeline Grant writes, lockdown Britain has surrendered its ancient freedoms far too cheaply. The lack of public concern about a slipping roadmap is more worrying than our government's risk aversion. It's my personal view that anyone who wears masks outside should be stripped from the voting rolls, but obviously that is going to happen. And you see the hollowness of democracy here again. Oh yes, we're all about liberty and freedom, except not now, because you have to wear a mask everywhere. You have to social distance 6 feet or 2 meters always. You have to sanitize your hands. You have to wash your hands 20, 30, 40, 50 times a day. We will tell you you're not allowed to leave your homes. We will say that essential businesses will be shut down. We will order you not to go to the park to see the cherry trees blossoming. We will do all of that because all of this talk of liberty is entirely hollow. Madeline Grant begins, I feel a familiar sense of frustration whenever I read the latest suggestions that June 21st may not bring the final end to lockdown we were promised. Everything about this is predictable. There's the comms style leaking and counter leaking, apparently designed to focus minds or nudge behavior rather than add clarity. There's the typically patronizing assumption that the public is too dim-witted to comprehend any nuance within the message. And of course, the extreme risk aversion and likelihood that the goalposts will move yet again. Well oiled before the pandemic, lockdown has lubricated the slippery slope as never before. Even our tremendous vaccine success seems to have made little difference. We've pivoted from expecting the country to reopen once the elderly and vulnerable were protected, to waiting for all the over 50s to be double jabbed, and one suspects children and household pets cannot be far behind. The clever people often deride slippery slope arguments as unsophisticated and basic, but as it happens, they are very often true. Well, as I've said before, in the last 50 or 60 years, every slippery slope argument has been proved true. More shocking than the high likelihood of further delay is just how few people seem concerned by it. Poll after poll confirms a desire for continuing lockdown and social distancing measures. While other countries push ahead, Britain remains stubbornly cautious about reopening. Some friends and acquaintances appear unwilling to accept the restrictions, even persist in any meaningful way. Given the reopening of schools and pubs, many will say, we're barely in lockdown, so why bellyache? Well, as it turns out, the people, or the masses, to put it more exactly, don't care about freedom. And to our elite, the freedom to get high, well, that is a basic right. And the freedom to practice whatever kind of deviant gender expression, well, that is sacrosanct. The rest of it, they don't give a toss about it. It is inconvenient to them. And here's a story that will not surprise anyone from Emily Craig at the Daily Mail. The people most worried about catching COVID judge other people's behavior more harshly, a study has claimed. Cambridge University researchers claim people were more likely to look down on others or react with disgust at questionable actions if they were afraid of COVID. There wasn't a clear link to the virus itself, but people may be less forgiving if they felt their own health was at risk, the scientists said. They added it meant people's judgments of others' behavior was not totally rational, but was tied to their own feelings. Well, as it turns out, man is not particularly rational. If man was particularly rational, why are these people wearing masks outside? Participants were asked to rate 60 hypothetical situations on a scale from not at all wrong to extremely wrong. The scenarios included a man leaving his family business to work for a rival company, or a tenant bribing a landlord to skip the queue to get their flat painted. People were also asked how they felt about a sports player ignoring a coach's order, or about someone marrying their first cousin. Individuals more worried about catching COVID views these situations as more wrong than those who were less worried about the spread of the virus. Professor Simone Schnall, a psychologist and senior author of the report, said, quote, "There's no rational reason to be more judgmental of others because you are worrying about getting sick during the pandemic. These influences on judgments happen outside of our conscious awareness. If we feel that our well-being is threatened by the coronavirus, we are also likely to feel more threatened by other people's wrongdoing. It's an emotional link." Let's go back to the chat. Hello to Metal Mike. Type 1 if you got the jab, 2 if you did not. One of my brothers asked me about this yesterday, and I told him I am not getting it unless it is made mandatory. And by mandatory, I mean if I'm going to be forbidden from buying groceries, from buying food and drink, then I suppose I'll have to get it. Short of that, I don't care whether I ever attend another movie theater, another concert, another sports event in my life. Travel, well, to start off with, I can't afford to travel, so I don't particularly care if I'm banned from doing it. Chad Chadson, our valiant moderator, says 2. Thank you for your service. We also get a 2 from Jim Bowden and Glib Medley, Quechalango, Pacaso 88, Chogan 666. Okay. 71% of Dems want to stay in lockdown, really, says Quechalango. Well, again, the lockdown indicates their moral superiority. I'll have something to say about Georgina Floydina in a little while. Birkin Sultanov says focus should remain on the architects of white erasure propaganda. I hear that Kant never wandered more than 20 miles from his birthplace, says Quechalango. Oh, that used to be quite common, you know. And it is quite common within the inner cities or overwhelmingly black districts of the United States. There are a great many blacks in the United States who have never lived within a mile, the same mile, their whole lives. Of course, Kant came up with the categorical imperative, which I consider to be an instrument of oppression. Metal Mike says Trudeau declared what happened in London an act of terrorism even before police provided any information. Well, because of course. Quechalango says doctorate in education is 2 to 3, submission to pause Ola. Okay. All right, Dr. Jill Biden. Yeah, I just can't. I just can't. I can't get over that. You know, I thought everyone knew this. Apparently, a lot of women don't know it. That unless you are a medical doctor or perhaps a dentist, or a doctor of divinity, you don't use that title, you know. But no, look, I have an EDD. Yeah, you and how many other midwits. Okay, and let's talk about Ron DeSantis. This is from the Capitol list. And just let me blow this up so I can read it on my screen. Karen Murphy reports, as gubernatorial candidate and Florida Commissioner of Agriculture, Nikki, Nikki, Fried, I find it so amusing that an increasing number of female politicians have stripper or porn star names now. Nikki with 2 Ks spends the weekend putting out fires sparked by her last-minute revisions to her financial disclosures. Governor Ron DeSantis emerges out of smoke on a concert stage to receive star treatment in Panama City Beach from a crowd of over 20,000. Videos from this weekend's Pepsi Gulf Coast Jam shows the governors emerging out of the smoke on the concert venue's runway as Crazy Train blares, and roughly 22,000 country music fans. Crazy Train. I thought that, isn't that Ozzy Osbourne? Erupt into thunderous applause. He throws his arms in the air, encouraging the crowd even more, clearly enjoying the experience. Amazing. A man backstage is heard on a video saying, as DeSantis takes the stage, this guy's a rock star. We have a very different praxis up north. This is from Steve Watson at Summit News. As America begins to open back up, fears of a two-tier society are becoming a reality, with the announcement that popular bands and artists will perform live shows, but only for fully vaccinated audiences. 3 gigs in particular made headlines, as it was confirmed that Bruce Springsteen will revive his Broadway musical starting June the 26th. New York band The Strokes will play at Irving Plaza June 12th. And Foo Fighters will perform to a capacity audience at Madison Square Garden on June 20th. The one thing all 3 events have in common is that anyone wishing to attend will have to prove that they have been fully vaccinated against COVID-19. It isn't yet clear how this will be enforced, but it's likely to be via a vaccine passport system such as the Excelsior Pass that was tested at several events in New York earlier this year, including sports events at Madison Square Garden. The Excelsior Pass is based on a health pass system developed by IBM, meaning that it can be easily adapted for use by events organizers or a city, state, or nationwide basis. A poll released in April found that over half of Americans are on board with vaccination passports. As previously highlighted, musicians who have voiced opposition to such vaccine passport systems face cancellation and ostracism from the live circuit. And, some good news, more good news from the Epoch Times. Mimi Nguyen Lee, Texas Governor Greg Abbott on Monday signed into law a bill to ban government entities and private businesses from requiring proof of vaccination amid the CCP virus pandemic. Texas is open 100%, Governor Abbott said. Oh, yes. This is another form of social distancing, which is proved to be useless. This is from Crane's New York Business. Sales of plexiglass tripled to roughly $750 million in the U.S. after the pandemic hit, as offices, schools, restaurants, and retail stores sought protection from droplets that health authorities suspected were spreading the coronavirus. There is just one hitch. Not a single study has shown that the clear plastic barriers actually stop the spread of the virus, said Joseph Allen of Harvard's Chan School of Public Health. We spend a lot of time and money focused on hygiene theater, said Allen, an indoor air researcher. The danger is that we didn't deploy the resources to address the real threat, which was airborne transmission, both real dollars, but also time and attention. The tide has turned, he said. The problem is it took a year. Yes, the elite wants us to be terrified, to every person on earth to be terrified of every other person on earth. And the political implications of that are rather obvious. Let's hear more about international man of mystery and supervillain Peter Daszak. This is from Natalie Winters at the National Pulse. EcoHealth Alliance President Peter Daszak, who collaborated with the Wuhan Institute of Virology on research funded by Dr. Anthony Fauci's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, appears to boast about the manipulation of, quote, killer, unquote, SARS-like coronaviruses carried out by his colleagues in China in a clip unearthed by the National Pulse. Daszak made the admission at a 2016 forum discussing, quote, emerging infectious diseases and the next pandemic, unquote, which appears to be at odds with Fauci's repeated denial of funding gain-of-function research at Wuhan. While describing how his organization sequences deadly viruses, Daszak describes the process of inserting spike proteins into viruses to see if they can bind to human cells as being carried out by his colleagues in China. Quote, then, when you get the sequence of a virus and it looks like a relative of a known nasty pathogen, just like we did with SARS. We found other coronaviruses in bats, a whole host of them. Some of them look very similar to SARS. So we sequenced the spike protein, the protein that attaches to cells. Then I didn't do this work, but my colleagues in China did the work. You create pseudo particles. You insert the spike proteins from those viruses, see if they bind to human cells. At each step of this, you move closer and closer to this virus that could really become pathogenic in people. You end up with a small number of viruses that really do look like killers, unquote. How is any of this legal? And this is an honest question. Yes, let's make viruses deadlier, and let's make it easier for them to be transmitted to people. This is monstrous, absolutely monstrous. And pushback against China. This is from Ian Hanchett at Breitbart. On Tuesday's broadcast of Fox's America's Newsroom, Senator Tom Cotton, Republican of Arkansas, argued that the United States should start punishing China for the coronavirus pandemic now and suggested revoking China's permanent most favored nation status, hurting the financing terms they get from international financial institutions, and revoking visas from CCP members and their children so they can't educate their children at American schools. He said China's chances of ever conceding that they're responsible for this virus is zero. But that new report from the Lawrence Livermore lab just confirms what I've been saying from the very beginning. Just use your common sense. The virus emerged in a city larger than New York, just a few blocks down the road from the lab where they research these viruses. Every bit of evidence we have points to those labs. There's lots of things we could do. Revoke their permanent most favored nation status, a bad mistake that we made 20 years ago, and one that Joe Biden was a big cheerleader for, as well as the elite to court. We could team up with our allies and take back the very favorable financing terms they get from international financial institutions like the World Bank. We could take away visas from Chinese Communist Party members and their kids so they can't send their kids to American schools anymore. There's no end to the things we can do to make China pay for unleashing this plague, and we should start right now. Well, another thing that could be done is banning Confucius institutes, as Governor DeSantis has done in Florida. This is from Steve Watson at Summit News. A British comedian has spoken out after he was turned down for a gig based on his race, sexuality, and gender. Nick Dixon, who has toured the UK comedy circuit extensively and had success as a movie writer, says that a comedy club operator informed a fan of Dixon's that he wouldn't be booking the comedian because he was a, quote, white, straight, able-bodied male, unquote. The club owner told the fan, quote, I kind of have a million billion really good white, straight, able-bodied male comedians I can call upon. I'm trying to find more of the opposite. When I say the opposite, I don't necessarily mean a black gay woman in a wheelchair, but I've seen how hard it is for female acts, black acts, etc., to get on good bills. Oh, really? Perhaps someone can remind me of that woman. Is her name Hannah? This woman from Australia who has become a major comedy figure, and her whole act is, men, don't you just hate them? Yeah, it's really tough for women to get comedy gigs. Really, really tough. Almost impossible. Let's go to the main body of lockdown skeptics. Vaccination doesn't add any protection to that gain from previous infection, says a not yet peer-reviewed studies of over 50,000 employees of the healthcare system in Cleveland, Ohio. Rand Paul tweeted, "Great news. Cleveland Clinic study of 52,238 employees shows unvaccinated people who have had COVID-19 have no difference in reinfection rate than people who had COVID-19 and who took the vaccine. Deaths in England and Wales have been below the 5-year average for 11 of the past 12 weeks. Social distancing guidelines mean Scottish learner drivers face 16-week wait for theory tests. Link between positive COVID tests and COVID deaths has been broken, says NHS leader, that is the chief executive of NHS providers, Chris Hobson, who last week criticized the scientific modeling seen by the government through much of the pandemic as crude and unreliable. Government infected by its own scaremongering propaganda over unlocking on June 21st, says Professor David Patton. My theaters will reopen fully on June 21st, come hell or high water, says Andrew Lloyd Webber. And apparently he's even willing to be arrested. Good for him. And I want to continue our reading of Hilaire Belloc's 1912 classic on economics, The Servile State. He writes, though it is evident that with a sufficient will and a sufficiently social vitality, property could be restored, it is evident that all efforts to restore it have in a capitalist society such as our own a note of oddity, of doubtful experiment, of being uncoordinated with other social things around them, which marks the heavy handicap under which any such attempt must proceed. It's like recommending elasticity to the aged. On the other hand, the collectivist experiment is thoroughly suited, in appearance at least, to the capitalist society which it proposes to replace. It works with the existing machinery of capitalism, talks and thinks in the existing terms of capitalism, appeals to just those appetites which capitalism has aroused, and ridicules as fantastic and unheard of just those things in society, the memory of which capitalism has killed among men, wherever the blight of it has spread. So true is all this, that the stupider kind of collectivists will often talk of a capitalist phase of society as the necessary precedent to a collectivist phase. A trust or monopoly is welcomed because it furnishes a mode of transition from private to public ownership. Collectivism promises employment to the great mass who think of production only in terms of employment. It promises to its workmen the security which a great and well-organized industrial capitalist unit, like one of our railways, can give through a system of pensions, regular promotion, etc. But that security vastly increased through the fact that it is the state and not a mere unit of the state which guarantees it. Collectivism would administer, would pay wages, would promote, would pension off, would fine, and all the rest of it, exactly as the capitalist state does today. The proletarian, when the collectivist or socialist state is put before him, perceives nothing in the picture save certain ameliorations of his present position. Who can imagine that if, say, two of our great industries, coal and railways, were handed over to the state tomorrow, the armies of men organized therein would find any change in the character of their lives, save in some increase of security and possibly in a very slight increase in earnings? Well, that is precisely what happened in England after 1912. The whole scheme of collectivism presents, so far as the proletarian mass of a capitalist state is concerned, nothing unknown at all, but a promise of some increment in wages and a certainty of far greater ease of mind. To that small minority of a capitalist society which owns the means of production, collectivism will, of course, appear as an enemy. But even so, it is an enemy which they understand, and an enemy with whom they can treat in terms common to both that enemy and to themselves. If, for instance, the state proposes to take over such and such a trust, now paying 4%, and believes that under state management it will make the trust pay 5%, then the transference takes the form of a business proposition. The state is no harder to the capitalists taken over than was Mr. Yerkes to the underground. Again, the state, having greater credit and longevity, can, it would seem, buy out any existing capitalist body upon favorable terms. Again, the discipline by which the state would enforce its rules upon the proletariat employed would be the same rules as those by which the capitalist imposes discipline in his own interest today. And we'll have more from Hilar Belloc tomorrow. I want to talk about Julie Burchill, who is an English journalist who I've been familiar with since, 1976, I guess. From John Rogers at the U.S. Sun. Who is Julie Burchill and why was she sacked? From the Telegraph. The move came following a tweet by Burchill about Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's daughter. Born in Bristol, Julie Burchill, 61, started her career in journalism when she was just 17, landing herself a job on the New Musical Express or the Enemy, along with Tony Parsons as hip young gunslingers. That was the term used in the famous ad that led to their hiring, brought in to refresh the weekly music title as punk exploded. She left 3 years later so she could write on other subjects. I should mention that her and her then husband, Tony Parsons, it was what passed for music criticism from then was pretty much juvenile communist posturing. She's since written for The Guardian, The Sunday Times, and The Daily Telegraph. She married Parsons in 1981, and they divorced just 3 years later. They had a child, which they named Robert Fitzgerald Parsons. Burchill then married journalist Cosmo Landsman. The following year, in 1985, they divorced in 1992. She was co-founder of the Modern Review, where she had a long lesbian affair with Charlotte Raven, and then she married her third husband, Daniel Raven, in 2004. They remained together. She has 2 sons. Yes, and so she got sacked because of a tweet. There's so many others being sacked. It's pretty funny, I thought. She suggested after it was announced that the alleged or putative daughter, second child of Prince Harry and Meghan Mertz, was given the risible name of Lilibet Diana. Why didn't they name the child Georgina Floydina? Which is pretty good, I think. Following on from the Lilibet row, barrister Joanna Talk, 59, was suspended from her legal practice, the Family Law Cafe in London, over a so-called racist tweet posted in reply to Burchill's original remark. Referring to Meghan's mother, Doria Ragland, Miss Talk wrote, "No, Doria, don't black names matter?" Burchill wrote back, "I was hoping for Doria Oprah, the racist rotters," a reference to chat show star Winfrey, who had hosted Harry and Meghan's infamous interview back in March. The family law barrister then replied, "Dopra?" After a furious backlash online, Miss Talk apologized unreservedly and said she herself had children of color. Well, that didn't stop her from getting the sack, did it? And, oh, yes. And Meghan Mertz's bully brigade is at work. This is from Mark Duell from the Mail. Meghan's friend Omid Scobie gloats over sacking of Telegraph columnist Julie Burchill hours after he highlighted her so-called racist tweet that the Duchess should have named daughter Georgina Floydina. And this Omid Scobie is just, what a creep. What an absolute creep. But that's the sort of people who go into journalism now. He's been a victim of racism himself. although he could easily pass for white. There is an op-ed in Spiked by its editor, Brendan O'Neill, in defense of Julie Burchill again. Excuse me. I've heard some disingenuous guff in my life, but the idea that Julie Burchill's tweet about Megan Mertz's newborn kid was racist really does take the biscuit. The vile monstering of Burchill by the woke neo-royalists of the Meghan fan club confirms that cancel culture isn't only vicious and censorious, it is deeply dishonest too. This is the comment for which Burchill has been dragged into the metaphorical stocks and pelted with rotten tweets. What a missed opportunity. They could have called it Georgina Floydina. She was referring to Harry and Meghan's newborn daughter, Lilibet Diana. Why didn't the painfully right-on Duke and Duchess of Woke name their sprog after George Floyd rather than Queen Elizabeth and the Princess of Wales? That was Burchill's sinful jibe. Cue hysteria, actual hysteria. Twitter, as is its wont, went mental. That's racist, it cried. Isn't everything? Burchill was demonized relentlessly. Vile, racist, old bag, the be kind blob yelled in unison. Some mocked her over the death of her son by suicide, nicely reminding us that there are none so scummy as pissed off social justice warriors. Now Burchill has been ditched by The Telegraph, where she wrote a weekly column reportedly over that tweet. The entire thing is insane, even by the standards of today's fuming, finger-pointing culture of denunciation. Burchill's tweet wasn't racist. She wasn't racially mocking a 2-day-old child of mixed heritage, as the mad mob claimed. She was mocking Harry and Meghan's wokeness. She was having a pop at the radical pretensions of these two ridiculously privileged royals. She was taking the mickey out of the manufactured virtue of the aristocrats, posh politicos, and droning commentariat who think their taking of the knee to George Floyd makes them the reincarnation of Martin Luther King. Her target wasn't Lilibet Diana. It was Harry and Meghan and their slavish cheerleaders in the media elite. She was criticizing adults, which, last time I checked, is absolutely fine. And here's the thing. I'm pretty sure her furious haters know this, but they lie, or at least embellish, because they're bored, and it's been a few days since they had a thrilling big witch hunt, and they want another scalp to add to their tottering pile of scalps torn from people who made off-color jokes or tweeted something stupid when they were a teenager or said, if you have a penis, you're a man. You know, the usual speech crimes. O'Neill continues, Burchill has been harried and insulted and canceled by her newspaper, allegedly, for pricking the gaseous bubble of wokeness, a bubble Harry and Meghan have done their fair share to puff up with their blather about white privilege, LOL, mental health, and why climate change is really bad. But flying to Elton John's swanky French pad in a private jet is fine. Under the cover of standing up for Lilibet, the woke mob is actually persecuting someone for having the temerity to criticize the ridiculousness and hypocrisy of two of the most privileged people on earth. That's the most disturbing thing in this bizarre affair, not Burchill's tweet, which was actually quite funny, but the censorious precedent that has been set. You can't criticize these woke royals anymore. You'll be punished if you try. It's 2021, and someone has been mauled, ostracized, and reportedly sacked for making fun of royalty. God help us. Where's Cromwell when you need him? I've been saying for quite some time that, feminism is finished. And I'm sure a lot of people think that this is hyperbole. Those who do may think differently after I tell you this. Jaw-dropping. This is from The Telegraph. Oxfam training guide blames privileged white women over root causes of sexual violence. This is from Harley Dixon. An Oxfam staff training document says privileged white women are supporting the root causes of sexual violence by wanting so-called bad men imprisoned. I'm not making this up. In the wake of sex scandals that have rocked the charity, that is to say, specifically, the widespread sexual molestation of children in Haiti. Oxfam has produced guidance which states, quote, mainstream feminism centers on privileged white women and demands that bad men be fired or imprisoned. Accompanied by a cartoon of a crying white woman, it adds that this, quote, legitimizes criminal punishment, harming Black and other marginalized people, unquote. It advises staff to read a controversial book which concludes mainstream feminism is supporting, not undoing, the root causes of sexual violence. Oxfam said that the training was voluntary and the views are not presented as its own, but designed to help staff understand the issues. However, the charity was warned Wednesday that the document, compiled by its Alphabet People network and seen by the Telegraph, could breach equality laws, as it suggests reporting rape is contemptible. The 4-week learning journey recommends that staff read Me Not You, The Trouble with Mainstream Feminism, a book by Alison Phipps, a professor of gender studies at the University of Sussex. Summarizing the book's central premise, the Oxfam document says white feminists need to ask themselves whether they are causing harm when they fight sexual violence. It then links to Professor Phipps' Twitter account and a thread which summarizes the main themes of the book, including quote, white feminist tears. White feminist tears deploy white woundedness and the sympathy it generates to hide the harms we perpetuate through white supremacy. Oh, those poor white women who've been raped. Who do they think they are? Again, this is absolutely astounding. Feminism is finished. It's finished, well, I guess for two reasons. One, because a bunch of men showed up and said, we're women. These spaces are ours now. Shut the hell up or you will get hurt. And secondly, as we see in this example, oh, I guess someone looked at the studies on interracial rape. So for white women to complain about rape to the authorities is racist because it disproportionately affects Black men. Naomi Cunningham, a discrimination and employment law barrister, says the document may breach the Equality Act, which bans harassment in the workplace on the basis of sex. The message seems to be that a woman who reports a rape or sexual assault to the police and presses charges is a contemptible white feminist. I think any woman can make an arguable case that this has created or contributed to an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment, which is how the Equality Act defines harassment. Learning about trans rights and inclusion was drawn up in 2020 whilst Oxfam was still reeling for sexual exploitation scandals in Haiti and Chad. The charity suffered further blows in April this year when a female aid worker quit, alleging that there was a toxic culture and her sexual harassment complaint had been ignored, and it faced several allegations of sexual misconduct in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The training manual was written after the charity's Alphabet People network wrote to the leadership team, demanding that they publicly support trans people and suggested that any debate about rights was part of a, quote, patriarchal and white supremacist narrative, unquote, used by the far right. Yes, it's done. Let's see, Julie Bindel, who is a radical lesbian TERF, quite a controversial woman in her own right, adds to this, with the rape conviction rate at an all-time low, I would have hoped that a charity concerned with inequality and oppression would make combating sexual violence a priority, particularly one whose own history in this area is dubious at best. Much of what feminism has won now seems up for grabs. Well, yes, if we can't even determine what a woman is, or if women who are lesbians are bullied into having sexual relations with men who have become women, yes, feminism finished. And I'm going to end today's show by talking about Jeffrey Epstein, who was in the news again because of a profile of his career that appeared in Vanity Fair yesterday by Gabriel Sherman. The mogul and the monster inside Jeffrey Epstein's decades-long relationship with his biggest client, of the many mysteries that still surround the life and crimes of the notorious financier. The source of his wealth and thus his power might be the greatest. His long-standing business ties with his most prominent client, billionaire retail magnate Leslie Wexner, hold the key. There's something very, very strange about the Jeffrey Epstein story. None of it seems to make any sense at all. How did he become so rich? How did he become so powerful? It's not as if this fellow was in the business of making money for people. How did this fellow manage to buy what is perhaps the most fabulous apartment in all of New York City for a relative pittance? Well, it's been suggested, and I tend to agree with this interpretation, that it's because he was a procurer, that he provided women, young women, often underage women, to powerful people in exchange for protection and connections. Now, Leslie Wexner, well, he owned a bunch of clothing companies, including Victoria's Secret. And there is a curious reference here in this story that in a film deposition featured in the Netflix documentary Filthy Rich, Brad Edwards, a lawyer for some of Epstein's victims, asked Epstein if he had had a sexual relationship with Wexner. Epstein denied it. Well, what you read in the gossip pages is that Epstein became so close to Les Wexner because he acted as a procurer for Wexner, not of women, but of men, of young men. That, yes, Wexner grew the Limited from a single Columbus store into a global retail empire that included mall fixtures, Abercrombie and Fitch, Victoria's Secret, and Bath and Body Works. As I say, the gratitude that Epstein or that Wexner displayed to Epstein, it's out of all proportion to any services that he was providing, any financial services that he was providing. If he was providing sexual services, well, yes. One might ask the question about Jeffrey Epstein's criminal conviction, that the deal that was arrived at, the plea bargain, was illegal under Florida law. This was the plea bargain that was negotiated by Alan Dershowitz. Illegal under Florida law. And one of the people involved, apparently an official, legal official, attempted to complain, and apparently he was told that Epstein was under FBI protection, which would make sense as well. Who knows what the FBI or the Department of Justice may have been getting from Jeffrey Epstein. But we find out from this story, well, much of what we'd heard before about Epstein's mysterious rise to preeminence. And it begins with talking about the fellow that Epstein displaced. And his name was Levin. And he didn't earn all that much money. He wasn't paid that well by Wexner, perhaps because he was not acting as a procurer to him. In New York, he said, I had bankers constantly taking me out to dinner. Once a banker arranged a private tour of Le Bernardin. The kitchen was so clean you could eat off the floor, Levin remembered. Wexner entrusted Levin with increasingly ambitious prospects. Levin purchased thousands of acres of farmland in New Albany on the outskirts of Columbus, where Wexner planned to build his very own town, modeled on an 18th century Georgian Village. On one of Levin's trips to New York in 1989, Wexner asked him to meet a brilliant young financier who wanted to pitch an investment opportunity. Levin had never heard of the man, Jeffrey Epstein, which was odd. After working for Wexner for 7 years, Levin knew virtually every player on Wall Street. A few months earlier, Levin says, he had met with arbitrager Ivan Boesky. Levin's skepticism was confirmed as soon as he arrived at Epstein's Manhattan Avenue office. There were no visible signs of a trading operation, just Epstein sitting behind a desk that didn't even have a computer. Epstein was trying to explain a currency trade he wanted to do. I have an MBA from Ohio State, and I didn't understand a word the man said, Levin recalled. Levin went back to Columbus and reported that Epstein was a fraud. I told Les, stay away from him, Levin remembered. Wexner agreed not to do the trade. Levin was shocked when Epstein showed up in Columbus a few months later and announced Wexner had put him in charge of his finances. Levin tried to protest, but says Wexner wouldn't take his calls. Levin couldn't stand having Epstein as a boss. He was an asshole, the most arrogant person I ever met, Levin recalled. A few months later, Levin quit. Levin said Epstein taunted him on his way out. On my last day, Epstein walked in my office and held up a piece of paper. He bragged that Les had given him power of attorney over his money. I worked for Les for 7 years, and I never had general power of attorney. Epstein, Levin continued, even ordered him to surrender equity in Wexner's town project, likely costing Levin millions. Epstein basically said, if you want, you can fight it out, but I have a lot of lawyers, and I'll make sure it'll cost you a fortune. Now, keep in mind that this is the beginning of Epstein's career. How could he have such clout at the very beginning if he had not been juiced, as they say? I have a lot of lawyers. Well, those kind of lawyers are very, very expensive. Levin's life unraveled. He couldn't find a job. Friends told him Epstein was spreading rumors around Columbus and on Wall Street that Wexner had fired him for misappropriating funds. His wife filed for divorce and was granted custody of their 3 children. I had a nervous breakdown, he said. I was living out of my car for a while. Epstein ruined my life. I lost everything. Yes. Questions. How did he get his money? For it was Epstein's $500 million fortune that enabled him to sexually abuse and traffic hundreds of girls on multiple continents. There's no question that Epstein could not have done what he did without the support of people who provided him money, said attorney David Boies, whose firm represents numerous Epstein accusers, including Virginia Roberts Giuffre. David Boies, now there is a man that is juiced in. It's curious that he is representing numerous Epstein accusers. Epstein burnished his own myth, telling people preposterously that he only accepted clients with assets of $1 billion or more. But until recently, Epstein's only publicly named client was Wexner. When I asked Jeffrey who else he worked for, he'd say, I can't talk about it. Wexner paid Epstein's predecessor about $600,000 a year in today's dollars. Epstein, a former high school math teacher from Coney Island, Brooklyn, was worth a reported $559 million. His estate included, as I mentioned previously, a 51,000 square foot Manhattan townhouse bought from Wexner, a private jet formerly owned by the Limited, and a helicopter, a Caribbean island, a Paris apartment, a Palm Beach mansion, and a $10,000 acre New Mexico ranch. Epstein's brother's real estate company also had majority ownership of a Manhattan condo building on East 66th Street, where Epstein allegedly housed girls. The building was formerly owned by Wexner. Prosecutors say that Epstein built his vast sex trafficking ring through the 90s and early aughts. In other words, Epstein became Epstein during his long association with Wexner. But, you know, what I'm interested in, many people are, is who staked Jeffrey Epstein? Does this have something to do with Epstein's very close connections to Ghislaine Maxwell, the daughter of the late Robert Maxwell? One of the, how would I put it, most notorious crooks in British business history. Of course, Maxwell, his real name was Koch, appears to have been a communist spy. But after his death, which may have been an accident, which may have been murder, which may have been suicide, he fell or was flung from his yacht, which was named after Ghislaine. He had what was close to a state funeral in Israel. There are just so many mysteries about Jeffrey Epstein. Oh, yes, he supposedly committed suicide in prison. Oh, and then it turns out that the jail employees, the guards, weren't doing their jobs. Oh, and by the way, they're not getting sacked for some reason. I wonder how much we will ever find out about Jeffrey Epstein, given his connections to people like, oh, I don't know, Bill Clinton, you know? So let's have a final look at the chat. Chogokin666 says, yeah, but it seemed Mossad divers probably killed him. He worked for multiple agencies. Okay. The ranch has some interesting outdoor decor and design. Says, yes, indeed. Yes, it looks, well, kind of satanic, doesn't it? What else do we have? Don Willis says, no wonder Middle America is bored and easily entertained by its pocket mirrors. I mean, phones. Yes. Birkin Sultanov, it says in chat what I pretty much said on the air. Maxwell's father, I have read a biography of him by a fellow who writes the tell-all biographies of famous people in Britain. He wrote, well, a hilarious book about Conrad Black, of course. Let's see if I can find the name of this. Tom Bauer. Yes. He wrote 2 books on Maxwell. It was known on Fleet Street for decades that Robert Maxwell was a crook on an outrageous scale. But such was his clout through the very expensive libel lawyers that he could hire and his influence with, wait for it, the Labour Party, that he was able to squash all of this for the very longest time. Of course, Oberyn Waugh once wrote publicly in The Spectator, I have never attempted to conceal my belief that Harold Wilson is a KGB agent and has been since the 1940s. Maybe that has something to do with it. Okay. Yeah, that's it for today. And I'll be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. Tomorrow is Theater Thursday, and I'll be discussing Fred Zinnemann's A Man for All Seasons. On Friday, the book club, I'll be discussing Rush's American Pilgrim. And if you like the show or any part of it, I'd appreciate it if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not done so already. If you would like to support this live stream with a donation, which I kind of desperately need right now because I'm running out of time. Yes, you may have heard me mention that, well, my father died in May of last year, and he left an estate. It's not, an Epstein kind of estate, but there was, some money in it, some of which was earmarked for me. And I've just discovered how long the whole probate process can take, particularly when you have financial institutions who are simply not willing to do their jobs, as in transferring money when requested and refusing to take telephone calls from the executor. I'm not the executor, but I speak with the executor because I'm related to him. So I'd really appreciate it if you could make a donation to this live stream. You can do it through PayPal at kevin_grace@hotmail.com. Once again, kevin_grace@hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, donations to this live stream can be made via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. in these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.